Good afternoon, Biblionauts. My name is Professor Andrea Lorena Fernandez, aka Cronista de Indias, and we're back indoors for episode 5 of Latin American Divas. This one is titled The Brides of Christ, Nuns, and Religious Women. Thank you once again for your interest in Latin American studies. In the previous episode, episode 4, titled Guadalupe and Marianismo, the Other Face of Machismo, we described the cult of female spiritual superiority as the equally quixotic counterpart of exaggerated male aggression. The Marianista phenomenon enthrones the Virgin Mary's chastity, fertility, and sorrow as the ideal behavior for women to aspire to. And this is probably why the telenovela protagonist, as you're probably used to, is always crying from episode 1. She's fulfilling the Marianista predicament for herself. Nowhere is the cultural quirk of Marianismo more pertinent than in communities entirely devoid of men. Religious women helmed convents, beaterios, recogimientos, orphanages, third orders, cofradias, all over colonial Latin America, and many still do run institutions that are derived from those colonial ones. In today's lesson, we rely heavily on Susan Sokolov's chapter, The Brides of Christ and Other Religious Women, and The Women of Colonial Latin America. I highly recommend that volume if you're interested in the subject. The 3 topics for the day are going to be 1. Social role of convents, 2. Types of religious women according to institution, and 3. Conventual social pyramid. Female monasteries offered personal salvation and benefited others with their prayers. Their social purpose included surrogate family, alternative lifestyle to marrying a man, relief for sustaining surplus elite peninsular and criolla women, option for spinsters and widows. I have to do this because we have the chance to. Hold on. Lope de Vega is here. Ay, cosita. Okay, here's some snacks. Show yourself off. Okay. We were up to, there were convents were perfect options for spinsters and widows if they did not reach marriage. Urban institutions offered protection services, confessors, and patrons to the women. And many of the convents served as the bankers of the period. They were landlords, slave masters, they were lending institutions, and they managed rural and urban property. Employment for skilled and unskilled labor for artisans, lawyers, and administrators was an adjacent industry to any city that had a convent. So it was an entire industry unto itself. And the convent served as residence for women who were in temporary need of protection and female educational institutions for high-class girls. With the Counterreformation, that whole baloney that happened after the Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic Church was trying to regain its converts by becoming even more dogmatic, well, they reformed the nunneries, and this Susan Sokolov calls it the masculinization of nunneries, because one, female convents came under the orders of male religious orders, whereas in the Middle Ages, earlier on, hola mijo. Ay, amor. I love you. Yo te quiero, mijo. Okay. Whereas in the Middle Ages, they might have been run by women under the auspice of a bishop, so they were attached by it somewhat more sovereign than they were in the Counter-Reformation period. They became organizations of strict enclosure, strict regulation of novices, taking vows and communal life. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for example, were heavily regulated. The entire schedule throughout the day for you was regulated as a nun. A contracting economy during the 17th century is very well studied in Spain. If you take a look at authors like Maraval or Damaso Alonso, they highlight that the 17th century, in contrast to the high art that was being produced as Baroque art and Barroco de Indias, was also a century of decadence and economic dispossession. When the economy contracted in the 17th century, convent populations swelled because fewer women and fewer men could afford to sustain wives and marriages. Fewer Spaniards arrive in the colonies, and elite daughters go unwed rather than marrying racially downwards the local community. Um, the convent offered opportunities for self fulfillment. Some of the conventual requirements were if you wanted to become a novice, you needed religious vocation, free will, proof of age, baptism, limpieza de sangre, which means blood purity. You mustn't have any Muslim, Jewish, indigenous, or African blood. This must be certified with a document about your genealogy would prevent you from entering into the convent. Cash dowry, which may be paid in installments, or your family can mortgage their property. Or if you are in a lower class religious orders, you may be licensed to beg for alms to make up the money for your dowry. You also need a yearly income, 1 year of novitiate, where you take an exam for vows and then you're considered married to Christ. Professing nuns were on average older than marriageable age, and for the price of one bride, you could get two nuns in terms of the dowry. So it made financial sense in a downward turning economy to have more nuns. They provided an outlet for surplus women, surplus elite women. Let's go to the second item of the day, the types of religious institutions. They can be divided into two groups, nunneries and lay organization. Nunneries is for folks who have taken vows, and lay organizations are for people who are heartfelt believers and want to serve God but still have obligations in the secular world, so they cannot be enclosed. They stay outdoors but still perform religious duties. Let's work with nunneries. There were essentially two types of nunneries in colonial Latin America. The first one were white veil orders, the hat that you put on as a nun. And these were usually calcid orders, meaning that they wore shoes. They had cash dowry and a yearly income to pay for profession, marriage, and fees, all of which were very expensive. Some convents allowed nuns to manage, administer, rent, sell private income earning property, and even lend cash. So nuns had more command of their personal economic resources than married women, for example. Possessions included real estate, slaves, silvers, decorations, books, cash. These nuns would have lived in their own private quarters, where they would have kept all their junk, all their stuff. And although they were cloistered, they could receive visitors in an area of the convent called the locutorium, which it had bars, and you can talk with the person through bars and maybe pass a note or so. Needless to say that these white veiled women tended to come from the top of the pyramid of colonial society. At the top of the pyramid, we have peninsulares, and those are women and men born in Spain that moved to America. And right underneath them are the criollos. They're Spanish, white, Catholic, but American born children. So these were the only two sectors of society that usually entered white veil calcid orders. Let's go to the second group, the black veil orders or discalcid orders. This implies that oftentimes they didn't wear any shoes because their vows were about poverty, not necessarily economic and personal and literary pursuits like the white veil orders might have. They usually accepted women without dowries, these black veiled orders. They were likely to live a life of self-abnegation in the more classic Marianista, sorrowful woman style. Um, they were contemplative. A great example will be the Carmelite orders, who were austere and encouraged self-restraint, humiliation, suffering, and self-mortification. A famous character from this order will be Santa Teresa of Avila. Look her up on Wikipedia. She's fascinating, quite a tough cookie of a woman. Both white veil convents and black veil convents had auxiliary institutions attached to them, and they housed women that were called recogidas or educadas. Recogida means that they were picked up or collected and then kept into safekeeping, and educadas means that they were maybe temporarily living in the convent while they learned grammar, letters, and basic arithmetic, and maybe embroidery and music. So high class girls might have lived in the convent for a little while. The recogidas or educadas may have included illegitimate daughters of prominent citizens, unchaste daughters, unfaithful wives, women without male guardians, widows, wives whose husbands were traveling, relatives of the nuns themselves that might have been paying a visit to a cousin, a prima, and non-white women slaves and indias donadas that served as servants. Both convents had servant quarters which were more racially and culturally diverse than the private quarters in the white veil orders or the communal cells in the black veil orders. The second group of women that we'd like to talk about are lay women who perform religious functions without taking vows. One of these bizarre institutions were the beaterios, or places for holy women. That's what beatus means in Latin, holy or very good. It also means awesome, good. The requirements to enter were structured religious life with no vows. These were for women with no dowry. They were uncloistered, survived often by begging, handicrafts, domestic chores, usually were white, unmarried, or widows, though mestizas and mulatas, which is a combination of African with white, mulatas, and Indian women sometimes joined beaterios. So they were more diverse than the previous two fancy schmancier examples. Franciscan Beatas, we should note that were the first religious women in the Americas following the conquest. So the high class orders, the white veils and the black veils, the ones that had taken vows, were not the first missionaries. They were poor, racially, ethnically diverse women that came from Spain because they were devout. They really believed that their life of evangelizing the natives was their calling. So, and in the colonial period, they cared for orphan girls and taught poor girls how to read and write. So they had a very important social function. Um, Religious ecstasy in beaterios was always viewed with suspicion because there was no vow and there was usually no confessor to mediate between potential accusations of heresy or, God forbid, skipping over the priest's authority to find God on your own. That was very heavily frowned upon. And they were considered mainstream orders as marginal religious women. Recogimientos were secular houses of refuge for poor women to keep them away from things like prostitution. They also accepted honest widows, white and mestiza women. Orphanages were, as I said before, administered by white veil and black veil orders. Most convents raised orphan girls, and they might have been sponsored by an adult nun as a sign of either service to God or penance. Usually, the orphan girls were of poor Spanish origin, and only white women, this implies, were in need of protection. Only their honor was worthy of protecting because orphanages were not available to women of other racial extractions. And the goal was to marry off these orphan girls, so providing them with an education and modest dowries was a way to ensure they provided for themselves in the future. Demographic included local day students, so orphanages might be more populous during the day when students are visiting and more depleted at night when only the orphans stay to sleep over. Third orders were elite church-going women who became members of third orders, and they are closely tied to occupations, perhaps of the husband. Maybe the family was into the cobbler business, so they joined the cofradia or the third order of the patron saint for that particular industry. They were under the protection of the saint, as I said, and they were linked to artisan guilds, occupational groups, and they were organized oftentimes along racial and sexual lines. I started to describe the conventual social pyramid with the, imagine it again, with the peninsulares on top and the criollas right underneath them. This was the sector that lived in the white veil convents. The black veil convents might have included the next tier underneath them, the mestiza or the mestiza caste, which were a mix of white, Spanish, and other races. So they might have been able to enter into the Black Veil orders, though, as we said before, mostly the uppers as clones of society were accepted to these institutions. The ladies beneath the mestizas would be the the Indian women and the freed African women, um, depending on location. They might have been more voluminous than others, and they might have entered in beaterios, but not into black veils and white veil orders. Last but not least are the slave women who would have lived and worked in any of these institutions, but would not have been regarded as morally fit for the strenuous life of a nun. And we know nowadays that is absolutely wrong. Um, the conventional social pyramid accepted relatives usually joined the convent because they already had a family member living there. So they replicated the world of politics outside within the cloister. And they stayed in contact with male kin by talking to them through the locutorium, probably, and sending missives. Convents were self governing institutions by an abbess, a male majordomo, nuns who might have exercised the roles of assistant administrator, doorkeeper, instructor of novices, head nurse. So there were occupations for women within the convent that mirrored occupations outside. This is where the element of self-fulfillment might come in, and why this might have been appealing to women to enter instead of getting married or even after being married. Um, they received guidance from confessors, provincial bishops, and archbishops. They were subject to partisan politics, camaraderie, envy, and greed like any other political institution. And prejudice against Indian and African women was prevalent within them as well. They were perceived, as I said, as promiscuous, unstable, melancholic, and unable to fulfill the Marianismo expectations of the nuns. So we have had, let's see, 3 topics. Today we did social role of convents, the types of religious institutions and the women that lived in them, and the conventional social pyramid, which mirrored the colonial social pyramid outside. By the end of the 17th century, here's an bizarre, mind-blowing stat. By the end of the 17th century, 20% of Lima's population was cloistered. A female population was cloistered in an ecclesiastical institution, reflecting the economic decline of the Spanish Empire the world over. So 20% of limeñas were nuns by the end of the 17th century. That's like living in high school for the rest of your life. Oh hell no. Okay, let's conclude. And then the next 3 lessons will span uh, the next lesson actually will span 3 lessons, and we will address the most glorious nun of colonial Latin America, the 10th Muse, the Mexican Athena, this diva right here, Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz. She will occupy the next 3 episodes of Cronista de Indias. It is designed as a triptych. The first section will analyze the muse's poetry, the second will focus on her theater, and the third we will do her prose in 3 neat sections. While you wait, if you want to catch the Netflix series about Juana Ines, titled Juana Ines, it is an excellent way to go over her life, which I will conveniently skip for my lessons because you can find it on Netflix and it's far more entertaining. However, neither Netflix nor Wikipedia have an analysis of Sor Juana Ines's work from the context of her Baroque lifestyle. So we will go over Barroco de Indias with her. If you like the channel, content, have a thought, a question, I'll be happy to answer any historical question about any of these divas, leave a comment below. Hit the subscribe button so that you never miss an episode of your Latin American Divas with yours truly, Cronista de Indias, Professor Andrea Lorena Fernandez. And remember, see what it says right here? You gotta do epic shit.